So this is, Engels does this most notably in the Anti-Doring and the Dialectics of Nature. So this is Engels' assault on idealism. Well, what happens is the idealists get really, really smart. And a lot of them are very intelligent people, and a lot of them are scientists. Well, in the 19th century, what happens is you have a new philosophy that is called, well, there's a lot of different aspects, but it's called positivism. And what positivism says is, look, all this notion of objects or gravity, they're very abstract. What we need to be is we need to be scientists. And scientists only trust what they can see, their sensations. And that's all we really know about the world, is just our sensations. So Lenin, because this is starting at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, he calls this empirio-criticism. Empirio comes from empiricism, right, which means arriving from experience. So there's this empirio-criticism, or the empirio-critics. So again, empirio-criticism is this philosophy that we only know our senses. We don't really know the outside world. I can't really say that there's a podium. I know that I touch it. I know that I feel it. I know that I see it. I know that I can smell it if it's rotting or something. But those are all senses. Those are all my senses, right? And so what they do is they pose this as a materialist philosophy. They say, look, see, we're not idealists. We only believe in our senses. Well, you know, of course, again, there's a problem with this. If all you have are your senses, then the only thing that really exists in the world is your mind, right? Because if you say, no, I don't, there's no actual table, there's just my sensation that I call a table, then it's the same thing with other people. It's all just something appearing in your mind. Well, of course, Lenin deeply objects to this and says that for us to have a real materialism, we need to believe that there's an objective world, that there's a world outside of our mind. And yes, our mind perceives it in different ways, both in sociological facts, there's different ideologies, or in altered states, right? The world looks different if you're drunk than if you're sober, or whatever. But there's still an objective world, right? And we should posit that this objective world exists. And it's not mysticism to say that my sensation of things comes from actual objects. Now, of course, it's dialectical, so as I alter myself, as I alter those objects, my experience of those objects is going to be different, right? How I see a forest is going to be different if I'm hiking through it, and that's my practice, a practice of enjoyment, or if I've got a chainsaw and I'm looking to clear cut it. But nevertheless, that objective outside world still exists. And that's the essence of materialism, and our relation to it is the essence of dialectical materialism. So Lenin, basically Stalin, if you're interested, he has an essay called Dialectical and Historical Materialism, where he does a really good job of summing up most of Lenin's arguments in a much more readable form. Lenin's essay of philosophy is huge. It's like nearly 400 pages. And so it's a significant theoretical work. But if you're just looking for the highlights, that would be a good place to look at Lenin's dialectical materialism. Now, I mean, going back to the notion, dialectical materialism for Engels was focused on idealism because he was fighting idealists, right? It was a form of struggle. Lenin was focusing on empirio-criticism because he was fighting the empirio-criticists. So there's another contribution to dialectical materialism which comes from Mao. Now you have to realize Mao was incredibly educated. He read, you know, all of Marx, all of Lenin, and so he was aware of these issues. But his material context is different. Mao was writing in China. China at this time doesn't have a history of Descartes. It doesn't have a history of Berkeley. It doesn't have a history of Kant and all the other, or Hegel, or these other Western philosophers. However, it does have a history, its own philosophical history. Confucius and Lao Tse being the main ones. And then, of course, there's a smaller branch, which are the Chinese legalists, which are not super relevant to this discussion. But Confucianism is the dominant ideology in China. Now, Confucianism holds that there is an innate order in the world. And politics is just one aspect of this innate order. Leaders in China have what they call the mandate of heaven, which is to say that they are following the divine order insofar as they are good emperors or good kings, and they don't have it and should be overthrown or replaced with an appropriate figure if they're not following, the mandate of heaven. But at every level, there is a fixed, proper relationship between husband and wife, son and father, peasant and bureaucrat, the state and the individual, the emperor and everyone else. And if you violate this hierarchy, you are basically going against nature. So, what is Mao's dialectical materialism? Well, most famously, or at least most famously for me, I enjoy it quite a bit, right? What he says is there is chaos in heaven. The situation is perfect. Or something roughly. It depends on the translation. So, for him, the world is not made up of order, but it's made up of struggle. It's made up of contradictions. And so, for example, what he sees is that in everything there is struggle. There is always, in nature, there is in politics, two forces fighting against each other. Revolution and reaction, good and evil, progress, and this would also be reaction, nationalism or anti-imperialism against imperialism. And so the very way in which he understands the world is in the form of struggle. And there's, I'll get a little bit more into the core of dialectics about that. But this is important to note. As opposed to the idealist philosophy, that there is an ideal order to the world that is to be followed, Mao's dialectical materialism is a struggle against that. It's a fight against the very notion that there is an ideal order. But again, it's about the particular context. So, right, that's all great for Engels, who is writing against the idealist. That's all great for Lenin, who's writing against the positivists or the imperio-criticists. And that's all great for Mao, who's writing against Confucius. What does dialectical materialism have to say to us today? I mean, we don't have Confucianists running around, or idealists, or except out of philosophy departments, positivists, right? We don't have any of those groups. Well, I would maintain the thesis today is that dialectical materialism must be a struggle against postmodernism. What is postmodernism? Now, this is a very incredibly broad field, and there's a lot of different competing influences. But Antonio Negri says quite well in a letter to one of his friends. He says, "We postmoderns know that there are only bodies and languages." So what does this mean? Well, if you look at the works of Foucault, if you look at the works of Deleuze and Guattari, if you look at the works of Lyotard, they don't believe in the grand truth. They don't believe in narratives. They don't believe in objective truth. They would say, well, what does objective even mean? What they would say, for example, is objective is a linguistic construct that is either opposed to subjective, which is to say a matter of opinion. So really when you say objective, you mean that we all agree on it, insofar as our language is mediated and has a relationship that we can agree, so that if I say that hoodie is black, what I mean to say is we all have this linguistic construct of the notion black, and then when we apply it to that, it fits, and therefore we can say we're talking the same language. So this is a kind of language that we share. Or that there are bodies, which is to say there is our physical construction as people. For example, neurobiology, right? If I do something a lot, I get, playing ping pong, I get a muscle memory. So it doesn't have to be linguistic, I can just awesome at ping pong.